Today's episode, we're following a K2 climber whose fate was already sealed long before anything went wrong on the mountain. By the time she reached the summit, the system keeping her alive had already failed. Quietly, without pain and without warning. It was July 26, 2017, on the upper Abruzzi spur of K2, just below Camp 4, at an elevation of approximately 7,800 meters. Conditions were stable by K2 standards. Wind speeds, which often fluctuated sharply in this section of the route, had eased into a steady flow, and temperatures remained near minus 28 degrees Celsius, cold but within the expected operational range for a summit attempt. Visibility was clear enough to track headlamps moving slowly above camp as teams staged their ascent. The environment showed no immediate signs of escalation. Below the climbers, the glacier was still. Above them, the bottleneck remained intact, unchanged, heavily loaded, and structurally unstable in the same way it had been for days. At 3:42 a.m., Elena Markovic, 34, clipped into the fixed rope and moved away from Camp 4. She was a structural engineer from Zagreb. She had more than 10 years of experience climbing at high altitude and had already reached the summits of Manaslu and Cho-Oyu with supplemental oxygen. Her approach to climbing was careful and methodical. She planned each step, followed established procedures, and avoided unnecessary risks. Friends later described her as deliberate and patient, someone who rarely rushed decisions and preferred to work within clear limits rather than push beyond them. Family members said she treated climbing the same way she treated her engineering work, preparing extensively and believing that discipline and consistency mattered more than bold moves. Today was Elena's first attempt on K2. She was part of a commercial expedition that provided shared Sherpa support only up to Camp 4. Above that elevation, climbers moved independently along fixed lines installed earlier in the season. She was familiar with the mountain's history and understood that K2 rarely allows delayed decisions or partial retreats once a summit push begins. Timing errors on this route do not compound gradually. They narrow options until movement becomes mandatory. Her decision to climb that morning was shaped less by confidence than by constraint. Her summit permit was set to expire in 3 days, and the expedition's operational plan required the immediate removal of high camps after the current push. Forecast models showed no additional weather window within the remaining permit period. Turning back would not preserve the attempt. It would end it, with no opportunity for a second rotation and no mechanism to pause and reset. Elena clipped into the line and began moving upward, committing to a system that offered only forward progress and no meaningful recovery once its limits were crossed. Above Camp 4, the Abruzzi spur narrows into an exposed passage where climbers, snow and ice are forced into the same limited space. The slope steepens, footing changes from step to step, and the route funnels everyone towards the bottleneck, a slanted gully that runs beneath a large block of hanging ice. That ice weighs thousands of tons and does not act as a single solid piece. It shifts as temperatures rise and fall, cracks form inside it, and gravity pulls unevenly along its underside. Small pieces break off during the season, often without hitting anyone, but there is no reliable way to predict when a larger collapse might occur once climbers are already moving below it. To pass through this section, climbers depend on a system where every part must work at the same time. Fixed ropes are anchored into ice and rock, keeping climbers attached to the slope and preventing long falls on ground that cannot be climbed safely without constant connection. Supplemental oxygen offsets the thin air, allowing climbers to think clearly enough and move with some control. Speed here is not about pushing limits, but about reducing time spent under the hanging ice and avoiding backups that increase exposure. This system only works within narrow limits. Ropes assume stable footing, oxygen depends on steady flow in extreme cold, and feet must feel the ice to confirm placement on surfaces that range from solid to fragile. None of these parts can replace another. Above 8,000 meters, the system has no capacity for recovery. Elena did not sleep well that night. Earlier, her oxygen regulator had begun to ice, causing short interruptions in airflow that required repeated adjustments. Each time the flow returned to normal, and the problem never reached a level that would justify turning back, but it was enough to stand out as a small change from how the system was supposed to work. Before leaving Camp 4, she removed her right boot to improve circulation. The foot felt numb at first, but sensation returned after she warmed it with her hands. There were no visible signs of injury, no discoloration, no swelling, and no pain that suggested frost damage. She put the boot back on and tightened the buckles, but one of the lower buckles seated slightly off-center, creating uneven pressure along the side of her foot. At a lower altitude, that kind of misalignment would have been trivial. At this elevation, it would quietly begin to matter. Elena clipped into the fixed rope and began climbing, committing to the route and the narrow window the mountain was offering. From the moment Elena left Camp 4, the sequence that led to failure was already underway, though nothing about it appeared urgent at the time. During the first phase of the climb, her movement remained steady. The fixed rope was secure, her breathing was controlled under oxygen, and the pressure from the lower buckle on her right boot registered only as mild tightness. There was no pain and no immediate loss of function. Over the next 30 to 40 minutes, as she gained altitude toward the bottleneck, the effects of that pressure compounded. At nearly 8,000 meters, the body naturally restricts blood flow to the extremities to preserve oxygen for vital organs. The added compression along the outer edge of her foot further reduced circulation in that area. This sequence was later supported by examination of her boot, which showed uneven wear and deformation around the lower buckle, consistent with prolonged, localized pressure during ascent. By approximately 1 hour into the climb, tissue temperature in the affected area had dropped enough to interfere with nerve signaling. This progression was confirmed during post-recovery assessment, which documented frost necrosis extending upward from the lateral side of the foot, indicating prolonged cold exposure rather than a sudden injury. The absence of blistering or surface damage suggested that the injury developed gradually, without producing pain signals that would have prompted an immediate response. Despite this, Elena retained full strength in the leg and continued to bear weight, reinforcing her decision to proceed within the limited summit window. What changed was sensory feedback. Investigators later concluded that diminished proprioception likely impaired her ability to confirm precise foot placement on variable ice. This assessment aligned with witness accounts describing increasing instability during descent rather than a single triggering event. By 5:10 a.m., Elena reached the lower edge of the bottleneck. Climbers ahead of her slowed as one person struggled to free a frozen carabiner from the fixed line, creating a brief backup in the narrow couloir. Several climbers later reported that conditions at that point felt typical for K2. Light spindrift slid down the gully in short bursts, and small pieces of ice released from the serac overhead, sounds and movements that were common enough not to trigger alarm. Elena paused to rest while waiting for the line to clear. According to climbers behind her, she shifted her weight onto her left leg and briefly lifted her right foot, flexing it before stepping back into position. When she resumed climbing, her movement appeared controlled, but slightly slower than earlier sections. As she moved higher, Elena's oxygen flow began to fall out of sync with her breathing. Post-incident inspection of her equipment later showed moisture buildup inside the regulator, consistent with partial freezing at that altitude. Witnesses recalled hearing her adjust the valve and increase the flow rate, a common response that temporarily restored airflow but also increased oxygen use and physical strain. At approximately 8,100 meters, Elena stopped again on a short, steep section of ice. One climber below her later stated that she hesitated longer than expected before stepping up. When Elena lifted her right foot to move higher, the motion lacked its earlier precision. The crampon did not clear the ice lip cleanly and drifted slightly before she corrected the placement using her ice axe. She completed the step and continued. Climbers nearby later said the correction looked deliberate rather than panicked, suggesting she was still in control. Elena did not turn around. With the summit close and her permit window closing, she continued upward. At extreme altitude, loss of fine control often appears before any loss of strength. Investigators later concluded that Elena's right foot was no longer providing reliable feedback. She could still apply force, but she could not consistently confirm exact placement. At roughly 8,200 meters, beneath the serac, she leaned into the fixed line and stepped onto what appeared to be solid ice. The surface collapsed into a thin crust over softer snow, dropping her foot several centimeters. The movement was not enough to cause a fall, but it forced her ankle to rotate under load. Medical review later confirmed ligament damage, consistent with that type of twist. Elena did not react as someone in pain would. The rope absorbed the shift in balance, and she stabilized and continued climbing. However, The joint was now mechanically compromised, and circulation, already reduced by cold and compression, was effectively cut off. From that point forward, post-recovery findings showed the foot was no longer viable, even though Elena had no immediate way to recognize that the system had crossed a point from which it could not recover. At 7:02 a.m., Elena reached the summit of K2. According to radio logs and witness accounts from climbers who arrived shortly before and after her, conditions at the top were stable. Wind speed remained consistent with the early morning forecast. Visibility was clear, and there were no signs of incoming weather or sudden environmental change. Elena stayed for less than 3 minutes, long enough to confirm her position by radio and take a single photograph. No witnesses reported her removing her boots or sitting down, which aligned with standard high-altitude practice to avoid cooling and loss of circulation before descent. Problems began shortly after she started down. Climbers descending behind her later reported that Elena appeared increasingly reliant on the fixed rope, keeping more weight in her harness than expected for that section of the route. Equipment inspection after recovery supported this observation. Her oxygen regulator showed signs of moisture buildup and freezing, consistent with a valve that had stuck partially open. This would have caused oxygen to drain faster than planned, reducing her available supply and increasing physical strain during the descent. Witnesses also noted irregular foot placement as she approached the upper section of the bottleneck. One climber below her later told investigators that Elena's right foot appeared to slide or hesitate before several steps, even though conditions on the ice were unchanged. As her oxygen supply dropped and fatigue increased, more weight shifted into her arms and upper body, reducing her ability to correct small missteps. Near the top of the bottleneck, Elena reached a section where the fixed rope angled slightly downward and the ice surface changed from hard blue ice to a thin layer of compacted snow. To move through this transition, she attempted to step down onto a narrow ledge while still weighted into the rope above her. Witnesses later said this was a common place for missteps, as the ledge was shallow and sloped away from the climber rather than into the mountain. When Elena placed her right foot, the front point of her crampon failed to bite cleanly into the snow. Instead of locking in, it skated a short distance. Because she was already leaning into the rope, the slip did not turn into a free fall. The rope caught her immediately, but the sudden drop forced her body weight downward, while her foot was still partially planted. Her right ankle twisted sharply under load. Climbers nearby reported hearing a dull impact rather than a slide, consistent with a joint collapsing rather than a fall continuing. Later examination confirmed that the ankle joint suffered a catastrophic failure, leaving it unable to support weight or maintain stability. Elena remained hanging in the rope, upright but unsupported by her legs. She tried to place her foot back on the slope but could not control it. Climbers above and below moved in to secure her, clipping her into a nearby anchor to prevent further movement. They attempted to help her stand by shifting weight off the injured leg, but witnesses later said her lower body did not respond in a coordinated way. She could not bear weight, and she could not assist in repositioning herself. At that point, her ability to descend under her own power was gone, and the situation moved beyond anything that could be corrected on the mountain. Rescue above the bottleneck was not a realistic option, even with experienced climbers nearby. At that altitude, helicopters cannot operate safely or hover with enough control to attempt a lift, and no aircraft capable of reaching that height was available in the region. There was also no spare oxygen staged above Camp 4 that could be brought to Elena in time. Any additional cylinders were stored far below, and carrying them back up through the bottleneck would have taken hours and required climbers to re-enter the same danger zone she was trapped in. The terrain itself made rescue mechanically impossible. The bottleneck is a steep, narrow couloir with hard ice underfoot and a massive hanging serac directly overhead. There is no flat ground, no secure platforms, and no room to set up a hauling system. Lowering an injured climber would have required multiple anchors, controlled rope systems, and coordinated movement, all while other teams were still moving through the same fixed line. Any hauling or lowering attempt would have placed rescuers directly beneath the serac and in the same fall path as Elena, creating a serious risk of multiple fatalities. For this reason, climbers later told investigators that attempting a technical rescue would likely have caused more deaths without improving her chances of survival. Elena remained clipped into the fixed rope and secured to an anchor while nearby climbers descended to alert the expedition team below. As minutes turned into hours, the oxygen she had left continued to drain, and the cold further reduced her ability to stay conscious or responsive. She could not stand, could not shift her weight, and could not assist in her own descent. There was no way to warm her, no shelter to protect her from wind and exposure, and no treatment that could be administered at that elevation. She was effectively immobilized in a place where immobility is fatal. When climbers returned later with additional support and limited supplies, Elena was no longer responsive. At some point during the wait, she had lost consciousness as oxygen levels dropped and her body temperature continued to fall. There were no signs of a sudden final injury or collapse. According to a later medical review, her condition declined steadily, consistent with prolonged exposure and worsening hypoxia at extreme altitude, until her body could no longer sustain itself. The investigation showed that Elena did not die from a single sudden event. The cause of death was determined to be hypoxia, combined with traumatic failure of the lower limb, meaning her body was deprived of oxygen, while a severe leg injury prevented her from moving or descending on her own. Neither factor alone would have been immediately fatal, but together they removed all remaining options. Investigators found no evidence of a storm, ice collapse, or one decisive mistake. Instead, a series of small problems accumulated, each reducing her ability to respond until the system could no longer recover. Examination of Elena's right foot revealed deep frost necrosis extending above the ankle, confirming that a frost injury had begun hours before she reached the summit. The injury developed without pain or obvious warning, gradually disrupting nerve signals and making foot placement unreliable. By the time the ankle failed during the descent, the underlying damage was already advanced. Investigators concluded that when Elena stood on the summit, the outcome was effectively set. Even though there was no clear moment when that became visible, Elena Markovich did not die because of a reckless decision made at the summit. There was no sudden mistake, no ignored warning, and no external event that forced the outcome. Her death had already begun earlier, when a small mechanical issue combined with the limits of the human body at extreme altitude and pushed the system past its point of recovery. By the time the injury showed itself during the descent, the outcome was no longer negotiable. When Elena stood on the summit of K2, she was still alive, still moving, and still making decisions. But the system that kept her alive had already failed. She just had no way of knowing it yet. Thank you for watching. Click here for more videos.